FTN DataCast, the fantasy football podcast where data drives the discussion. Here are your hosts, Adam Pfeifer and Tyler Loechner.
Welcome back, everybody. This is the FTN DataCast, presented, of course, by the FTN Network. Adam Pfeifer, Tyler Loechner with you, as always, as we continue our team previews with the NFC West. Monday was the defending Super Bowl champion Los Angeles Rams, and we're going to move over to the San Francisco 49ers, Tyler, who I think are one of the more polarizing teams in maybe the NFL, but definitely in fantasy, because there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of really interesting players, and a lot of storylines. So this should be a fun episode with San Francisco.
Dude, the 49ers are like a make or break fantasy team. They were last year. I think they will be again this year.
We've talked about them a lot already, too.
We have. And there's not that many fantasy relevant players, but they're all just really good.
Yeah, they're close to the high end, and they're exciting, right? Trey Lance, exciting. Deebo Samuel, obviously, incredibly exciting. George Kittle, Ayuk, and then you have a pretty top-heavy team, but I think there's cases to make for and against almost every player. So, again, if you missed out on the Rams preview that was uploaded on Monday, we're going to be doing these pretty much, couple a week until we finish all 32 teams. And also, if you missed out on the positional previews, they are up. I would highly encourage you to check those out and subscribe, rate, review, all that great stuff. FTN DataCast on iTunes, whatever platform you listen to podcasts on. Let's get into San Francisco.
I want to start with Lance, the QB.
I mean, we have to, dude, right? I mean, Trey Lance expected to start at quarterback for the 49ers this season. Jimmy Garoppolo, as of this recording, still on the team. There has been not just rumors, but expectations that he will be traded any day now, if not just cut. And we'll see Trey Lance, who, look, I mentioned this number a lot, but he played 3 games where he actually played meaningful snaps last season. In those games, 0.64, I believe it was, fantasy points per dropback, which would have tied for the league lead.
It's like Lamar Jackson-esque.
Exactly. It was right there with Lamar Jackson over the last couple of seasons. Again, very small sample, but he also averaged 10.3 rushing attempts per game. And it wasn't just scrambles or anything. They were designed. He had 31 rushing attempts in those 3 games. 19 were designed. Trey Lance, the second Jimmy Garoppolo is no longer the team, he's going to go from QB 12, 13-ish range where he's going now to probably 8, 9, 10.
Lance, I wrote an entire article in February, which was, is Trey Lance a fantasy football QB1 if he starts for the whole year? And the answer is just yes. That could have been
I was going to say,
article.
It should be.
There was only one game where he underwhelmed as a fantasy player. I actually don't have the week that it was in front of me, but he finished as the fantasy QB 20. So, pretty brutal. But in that week, we have a tool called expected fantasy points. He was 11 fantasy points under expectation
That's
week,
insane.
Which is, you can chalk that up to bad luck or maybe some rookie play, whatever. But scoring 11 fewer fantasy points than expected means that he was in position to have a nuclear week. Just 11 fantasy points is basically 3 full passing touchdowns.
That's probably what Lamar Jackson was. Remember the Marquise Brown game against Detroit where he dropped 3 touchdown passes?
Yeah.
That's probably in that same range of expected fantasy points that didn't come to fruition.
So I don't know what to chalk it up to, but whatever you want to, that's a signal that game was not as good as it should have been. And yeah, Trey Lance he's the ultimate Konami code quarterback. I looked at FTN data last year among quarterbacks who played at least 150 snaps. Lance ranked second in fantasy points per snap. Can you guess the one quarterback who was ahead of him? This is a softball for you. This is a softball question for you. In fantasy points per snap, Josh Allen.
Oh, I thought it was a trick question because Jameis was really good.
Oh, no, he was good.
Because fantasy points per dropback, Jameis led the league. But it was obviously because he had the 5 touchdown game in week 1. And then he obviously I think he got hurt. He tore his ACL throwing a touchdown pass and then didn't play the rest of the season. So, but yeah, Josh Allen, he's good. We'll talk about him with the Bills probably. You right?
So, probably. So, and then Lance, he has an all-pro in Deebo Samuel. He has an all-pro in George Kittle. He has Brandon Ayuk, who, I completely love. Mm-hmm. He has the best run game scheme in the league. So, just the situation is awesome too. So yeah, I love Lance. I mean, I don't think there's any fantasy analyst that doesn't love him.
Yeah, like every day you see somebody touting Trey Lance, and it's fully like it makes a ton of sense. The offense is great. We've seen Kyle Shanahan make like the system is so good for any quarterback, but especially this will essentially be Trey Lance's rookie season, right? We can pretty much say that. I know he's not technically a rookie, but like just get the ball in Kittle's hands and Deebo's hands and Ayuk's hands and let them make plays after the catch. This is Jimmy Garoppolo, since he's been with San Francisco, has been among the league leaders in percentage of yards after the catch. Like, I'll pull up his exact number last season, but like Trey Lance can just be fine as a passer and still be great in fantasy because the talent around him is great. He's obviously going to average, I would say probably averages like 8 to 10 rushing attempts per game. And like, we don't even know exactly what the upside is because we saw coming out of college, the tools and the numbers he put up and everything. But like, there's still a little bit of unknown with Trey Lance of how good he could really be, which is obviously exciting in its own part. Where do you have Lance now, and where would you have him if Jimmy Garoppolo, when Jimmy Garoppolo is no longer on the team? I think at this point we should just probably rank him as if Garoppolo's not even there, because like if Garoppolo's there somehow miraculously in week 1, it's not like he's starting.
So I do just rank Lance as if Garoppolo's not there. I have him as the QB 12, but you put him anywhere, QB 10, 11, 12. I don't really care too much, but yeah, I would draft Lance and roll with it as if he's just going to be my full-time starter. That's my comfort level with him. The only thing is like, okay, why is Jimmy sticking around? Like, do the 49ers not really believe in Lance? That's the only thing kind of going on in the back of my mind. But
they traded up so high to get him too.
I know.
That's the thing I keep forgetting. Like, it's not like they just like, he was kind of there for them. Like, they moved up a ton. And a lot of the rumors were, it's for Mac Jones, and it was Trey Lance, who is more of the ceiling, obviously. Mac Jones clearly more pro ready coming out of college, but like there's just really not a scenario where I see Trey Lance not starting the season. And yeah, like the upside is immense. Like I mentioned, 10.3 rushing attempts per game in those 3 games. And keep in mind, one of those, I believe it was the Cardinals game, that was in a half. We got to remember that.
Yeah, he only played a half a game for one of those.
So it was really, I say it's 3 games. It was really like 2.5 games. So the upside and the floor you see, again, smaller sample, but it's kind of just a glimpse of what could be with Trey Lance. Any other thoughts on Lance? He's very polarizing in fantasy already.
No, just you can wait on quarterback and draft Lance and walk away feeling happy. Because again, we've talked about this before. If he doesn't pan out or anything, streaming quarterback is really still very viable. I know that quarterback is extremely deep this year. And the top level talent is very, very, very good and significantly better than what you'll get from streaming. But that doesn't mean that streaming is not still viable.
Let's move to the backfield, where this has been the revolving door of fantasy, a Kyle Shanahan backfield in San Francisco. He has had in San Francisco a different leading rusher in 5 straight seasons. Elijah Mitchell last season, we'll talk about. Jeff Wilson, Raheem Mostert, Matt Breida, and Carlos Hyde. 5 straight seasons, a different player has led this team in rushing. Going into the season, or this past season, the hype was around Trey Sermon. The fit with the zone running scheme was great. He did a lot of that in college, but then we got the reports that he wasn't, exactly living up to the hype in OTAs and training camp, and Elijah Mitchell was impressing. And then week 1, Raheem Mostert gets hurt. Trey Sermon was a healthy scratch in that week 1 game. Elijah Mitchell comes in and kind of just runs with the job, pun fully intended. Look, Elijah Mitchell, a lot of people still like him, and I get it. Like, great run, one of the best running schemes in football. You have Juszczyk, you have George Kittle, and you have a very good run blocking offensive line led by Trent Williams. Like, those 3 players alone are 3 of the best run blockers at any position in football. 963 yards, 5 touchdowns, 18.8 carries per game. Like, that's great. I have a lot of concern with Elijah Mitchell. I'll let you talk about him first, but like, when I started doing content in terms of like 2022 candidates to be bust players, I'm not going to lie, Elijah Mitchell was the first player that came to my mind. I'll talk about that more in a little bit, but what are your thoughts on Elijah Mitchell and this entire backfield? Because if I asked you that and you literally just shrugged your shoulders and said, I don't know, I would be okay with that because it's his backfield. It's been the case for 5 years now.
Yeah, honestly, I don't know. Mitchell probably will be the guy, but maybe Trey Sermon takes a step up this year. Like Sermon is basically completely free in fantasy drafts. I don't even think we really need to talk about him. He's like RB 70 in fantasy ratings or ADP.
He might not even be the number 2 after they drafted Tyrion Davis-Price.
Right. I actually have Tyrion Davis-Price ranked ahead of Sermon still, which, but talking specifically about Mitchell, the 49ers are in a run-first offense. I think you mentioned this. They ran 48.3% of the time, which was the 4th highest rush rate in football last year. But then you add in the likelihood of Trey Lance starting, who, what are we expecting? 8 to 12 rushing attempts per game. And then you have Deebo Samuel, who basically became like the team's part. He was like, he wasn't the leading rusher on the team, but he accounted for 24% of their rushing attempts from week 11 onward. Like Samuel became a guy who started stealing 5, 6, 7 rushing attempts per game, and the touchdowns, the really high valuable touchdowns. And Mitchell does not catch the ball. He only had 19 receptions last year, which is, just extremely low. I have him ranked as a very back end RB2. I have him at RB23 right now, but he's probably my least favorite of that bunch. I think once I get to that range, once I get past ETN, we were just talking about the other player on the Rams. Once I get past like ETN and Cam Akers, I'm probably taking a break on drafting running backs.
Same.
So that means I'm probably just completely skipping over Mitchell in the vast majority of my drafts.
Yeah,
even though I have him ranked as a tail end RB2, I think he's in a separate tier.
Yeah, so like Elijah Mitchell, he was great last season. There's no reason not to project him as the number 1 running back going into the season. But like he didn't get goal line work last season, right? And Deebo played a part in that, and I don't expect Deebo's rushing volume to be the same or anywhere close to the same, and we expect Deebo's rushing touchdowns we'll talk about to go down. But like I mentioned, Lance, over 10 carries per game. And again, 19 of the 31 were designed. So it's not like it was like that's going to be part of their offense clearly. And that's going to take away from some carries from Elijah Mitchell. I think Deebo's not going to just not carry the ball at all this season, right? He's not going to see what he saw last season. Because there was that stretch last season where from week 11 on, including the playoffs, like you said, Samuel had 24% of the team's rushing attempts. I still think that's going to be at least a part of their offense. That'll take away from some carries. Plus, like, I know this team, in terms of draft capital for running back, isn't the greatest example because they've had Raheem Mostert, undrafted player, lead the team in rushing. Jeff Wilson, undrafted player. Matt Breida was a later round pick. So it's like, they don't really care. But, like, they still drafted Tyrion Davis-Price in the 3rd round. That's not insignificant to me. And then the passing game work, right? Like, he had 19 catches this season. He ran 13.7 pass routes per game, which were not great for running backs, not even close. And he didn't play a lot on 3rd down at all. Like, JaMychal Hasty was taking him off the field on 3rd downs. So I just don't know if there's a massive ceiling. And if there's any games where this team, like, I still project this team to be an above average football team as long as Trey Lance is solid. But any games that they're behind, Elijah Mitchell's going to be Damian Harris-like. And the difference is Damian Harris actually gets more goal line work. Like, Elijah Mitchell's goal line work was bad last season. Really went overlooked. But I just think, okay, you can say, okay, Deebo's going to lose goal line touches or carries, so that's going to help. But, like, Trey Lance might gain them. So, I don't know. Like, Elijah Mitchell, I don't like to say I won't draft a player because everybody is draftable. But there has not been a draft this season so far, this summer, where I've had Elijah Mitchell on my team. And I just think, like you said, it's a perfect point. Where he's going is where I stop drafting running backs. And I just load up on receivers and start to look at the tight ends and stuff like that.
Okay, you mentioned that his goal line rushing attempts were bad. And I just looked this up on the FTN Fantasy Red Zone report. And yeah, dude, that's way worse than I was expecting it to be. He ranks 44th among running backs in goal line attempts last year. He only had 5. That's the same as Adrian Peterson, Ronald Jones, Ty Johnson actually had more. Latavius Murray had more. Tevin Coleman had more. Yeah, that's tough. Like, Duke Johnson had the same amount.
Would you be surprised if his goal line usage, again, he's not going to score 0 touchdowns.
Actually surprises me.
Right. I think it'll surprise a lot of people. Would you be surprised if his goal line workload was similar to Miles Sanders from this past season? Not 0 touchdowns, because that's like insanely difficult to do, but like Jalen Hurts was top 5 in carries inside the 5-yard line. He had like 13 or 14.
So yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. And last year's data supports that. Miles Sanders had 21 red zone rushing attempts. Elijah Mitchell had 21 red zone rushing attempts. Sanders had 6 goal line carries. Mitchell only had 5. So like they basically were identical to each other.
I think they're very similar. Here's my thing. I think Elijah Mitchell and Miles Sanders are very, very similar. Miles Sanders goes a couple rounds later.
Yeah.
I'll just take
That's a good point.
Miles Sanders' passing game role, not great. I think it's probably a little bit better than Mitchell's because there's a better chance that Sanders can play on third downs. They're both going to have quarterbacks that are going to run the football 8 to 10 times a game. Both will probably get – Trey Lance was getting a lot of design carries in the red zone too in those games he played, especially that Arizona game, I believe. They're in similar situations that have – except Miles Sanders probably has less competition. I like Boston Scott. I like Kenny Gainwell. But like in terms of overall carries, I think San Francisco has more players that can take carries away from Mitchell.
I like that. If you like Mitchell, just wait and draft Sanders.
Yeah, and I literally just thought of that now. Like I was just thinking about it. Like they're in the same situation, and I think the Eagles might have a slightly better offense. If not, they'll be right in that same range, I think. Just give me Miles Sanders at a discount over Elijah Mitchell. Closing thoughts on this backfield. Any interest in, later round flyers and Tyrion Davis-Price, because they did draft him in the 3rd round, and we have seen a different running back lead this team in rushing for 5 straight seasons now.
Yeah. I mean, the draft capital's there. The team seems to just completely hate Trey Sermon.
It sucks too, because Trey Sermon was going to be one of my favorite late round running backs in the entire fantasy football landscape before the NFL draft. And now I'm kind of backing off a little bit.
Yeah. I just don't think they like him. I hope he gets traded, honestly, because I still think he's good, but
I would have liked to see him in Atlanta, but it's like even now, like even if he went to Atlanta or something, like they still have a lot of running. It's just tough to find a team to trade for a running back where it's like, oh, he's going to be the future running back. But like Sermon, it's interesting because he looked good. What was the one game? I'll pull it up right now. But he got because Mitchell missed a game or two, and Trey Sermon came in and started because he was finally, active on the roster and playing. And then he got a concussion. It was I forget which game it was, but he looked good and then got a concussion and then missed. He didn't play from week 11 on. So I would like to see what we can see from him, but it's tough.
It's a really crowded backfield. It's Mitchell, Jeff Wilson, JaMychal Hasty, Trey Sermon, and Davis Price.
Who do you think the third down back is? Might be Davis Price.
They kind of gosh, dude, it could be any of them, honestly. It'd be good if it's Davis Price, then yeah, that definitely makes him interesting to me. But it's that's a lot of players, and maybe outside of Trey Sermon, we've seen Kyle Shanahan use all of them in featured roles. So it could be a running back carousel again this year. That's another reason not to totally love Mitchell, is like they have good backups. Right,
and it's like we've seen them in the past, right? Mostert misses time. Jeff Wilson is not just like serviceable in that role, but good.
Just smashes, yeah.
That's why there's appeal still in Davis Price and Sermon, because the scheme is so favorable and so good for running backs that like if Elijah Mitchell, who did miss some time last season, misses time, Davis Price, whoever it is, if it's Davis Price or Sermon, they can be really good.
Davis Price is a lot bigger than Mitchell, isn't he? How big is Mitchell?
So Davis Price, I remember
he's like 220, 6 feet. Yeah. Mitchell is 5'10", 200. So maybe Davis Price is the goal line back.
And we saw them give Jeff Wilson goal line work over Mostert a lot of those years, and Jeff Wilson was really good in that role. So it's entirely possible. The backfield is always going to be an interesting talking point with San Francisco. Let's get to the pass catchers, and we have to start with Deebo Samuel, who, if it weren't for Cooper Kupp last season, we'd be talking about Deebo Samuel, I think, a lot more of what he did. And he's the perfect example of a player is injury prone, quote unquote, until he isn't. And Deebo Samuel stayed healthy last year and was not just one of the best players in fantasy, one of the best players in the entire NFL.
Yeah, dude, he smashed and rightfully earned first team All-Pro. I think that was really cool to see. So Deebo is a fantasy wide receiver 1. We'll start with that. I have kind of been like raining on the Deebo Samuel parade a bit all off season. I wrote an article before the draft, I think. Right?
Yeah,
Maybe right
I definitely want you to
agency.
revisit some of the stats because we talked about Deebo.
Yeah.
This was like on our second or first episode since we rebranded the podcast. And I definitely want you to hammer home some of those points because I'm in agreement, dude. Deebo is going consensus like wide receiver 5, 6, 7. He's my wide receiver 11.
Yeah, wow. You have him even a little bit lower. I have him as wide receiver 9, but I don't really mind him in like the 9, 10, 11 range. So I'll just go through some of the stats. Over the second half of last season, he did not lead the 49ers in targets. He wasn't even second on the 49ers in targets. He had 43 targets. Again, this is over an entire half of the season. This is when he started running the ball more. He had 43 targets. Kittle had 59. Brandon Ayuk had 55. And then Samuel was pretty heavily behind back at 43. He was also third in target. So he was third in targets, also in receptions, yards, and receiving touchdowns. But he did make up for it on the ground. So as we know, Samuel started carrying the ball between 5, 6, 7, 8 times per game. But what he did in that span, rushing, was like so completely unsustainable in my opinion.
Insane.
He scored a rushing touchdown in all but 2 of those games.
But look at the distance on those touchdowns too, though. It was like 20 plus yards out, 30 plus yards out. There was a couple where he scored from in close, but like...
I know. He's so good. He's so good at football. That's why I still have him as a tail end wide receiver 1. Earlier this offseason, I think his ADP was wide receiver 5. And I think that has slipped a little bit to wide receiver 7. So it seems like some people are catching on that of those really high value picks, Samuel carries a bit more risk. I have him at wide receiver 9. You said you have him at wide receiver 11. Still like him. Still think he's a good fantasy player. But I just, for my elite wide receiver, I want more guaranteed volume.
The one thing I will say is when Deebo was used in that H-back role where he was getting like 5, 6 carries a game, the touchdowns were great. They're not sustainable. They were great. For fantasy, we want Deebo not getting carries. We want him getting targets because they're higher value. Like you get more points for targets. They're better for fantasy. And that probably we'll see more targets, not overall, but just because you look from week 8 on. Remember, Brandon Ayuk, we'll talk about. I know you love Brandon Ayuk. We talked about Trey Sermon. Brandon Ayuk was not a full-time player for a lot of the season. Started the season off barely playing and then became not just like back in the rotation, but was a full-time player. He was like he was always leading his team in snaps and 90+% of the snaps, always leading the team in routes. From week 8 on, with Brandon Ayuk playing that full-time role last season, Deebo Samuel only averaged 5.8 targets and under 4 receptions per game. So if we look at this as a low volume passing offense, which it should still be, and you have Kittle, you have Brandon Ayuk, who's clearly shown when he's on the field, he makes plays. He's a good receiver. That's between that and the fact that just overall natural regression in terms of touchdowns and a little bit of uncertainty with Trey Lance. Like Trey Lance hyper targeted Deebo when he was on the field, but I think a couple of those games, Ayuk wasn't even active or not even playing. Kittle might have missed one of those games. So who knows if Deebo is going to be the number 1 target for Trey Lance. But between all that, that's why I moved him down to wide receiver 11. Just because like overall targets, like if the rushing's coming down and he's not getting goal line carries or anything like that, like I would rather have the guaranteed 135, 140 potential targets from CeeDee Lamb. I would rather have the targets from, who else do I have hired? T. Higgins. I'm trying to look at who else I have ahead of Deebo, but again, it's still in the back end wide receiver 1 range for me just because he's an elite football player. But I looked back, it was the second episode we recorded, it was the bust candidates, and we talked about Deebo Samuel. So I think it's very fair to question how good he'll be on a per game basis if he's getting 6 targets a game, which he was getting last season from week 8 on with Kittle and Ayuk firmly part of the offense.
Yeah. Can we talk about Ayuk now?
I was going to say go for it because I got to talk about Robinson on the Rams preview. So now go for it. Brandon Ayuk and Michael Gallup, they'll be on what, 90% of your rosters this season?
Bro, maybe even more. Brandon Ayuk, first of all, came in as a rookie, and I would argue maybe not like a league winner, but he was really good as a rookie after a pretty slow start. He scored, this is in 2020, he scored over 17 fantasy points in 6 of his final 7 games as a rookie. And that included like this awesome stretch in the playoffs. He was over 20 fantasy points in 5 of those games. A fantasy wide receiver 1 half the time over the second half of his rookie year. Then he came in, I was expecting great things during his sophomore year, and he just like completely fell out of favor for the entire first half of the year. He scored fewer than 10 fantasy points in 5 of the team's first 8 games. He was like threatened to be healthy scratched at some point, or like at a certain point he was just running routes just to run routes.
We thought it was going to be the next Dante Pettis.
We did, yeah. And I got real nervous. But then he got a lot better. And he wasn't completely dominating in fantasy over the second half of the year, but he was a very consistent player. And he actually ended up, from weeks 9 onward, he ended up finishing as the fantasy wide receiver 13 for an entire second half of the year after the start that he had. And that was with Deebo Samuel finishing as the fantasy wide receiver 5 in that same stretch. So I already mentioned that Ayuk was second on the 49ers in targets, receptions, yards, touchdowns over the second half of the year. I was a little surprised to see him almost as like a borderline fantasy wide receiver 1 over the second half of the year as well. So right now he's going as like the wide receiver 40 in underdog drafts. I have him ranked as the wide receiver 35. So I'm still drafting him ahead of that ADP. If Ayuk is my wide receiver 3, I am happy. I'm very happy with it.
Yeah, I mean, like he was the number 1 target on this passing game from when he was finally a full-time player. From week 8 on, it was over. It was like 6.5 targets per game, almost 68 receiving yards per game, and just under 14 full PPR points per game during that stretch. So I don't think it's crazy to expect him to compete for the team lead in targets, like by any means. From week 8 on, he was easily led this team in routes run. He was 19th in the NFL in routes run among receivers during that stretch. So, and like I said, he was like pretty much, once he firmly got back into the offense, was like, you looked at the game logs, it was Ayuk 90% of the snaps, 88% of the snaps, 85% of the snaps, 92%. Like it was fantastic. So I think he's in that same range where like he goes a little bit before like Chase Claypool, Tyler Boyd, right around Kadarius Toney. Like that range of receiver I'm really high on, because I think all 4 of the receivers I just mentioned have upside and have really, I think they're really good values. So Ayuk's a really interesting player because it seems like forever ago his rookie season where he was like one of the best receivers in fantasy down the stretch when everybody was out. And it was like, okay, it's kind of like Amon-Ra St. Brown, right? It's like, okay, he did all this, but like nobody was healthy. Kittle, Deebo were inactive. And then the way last season started, it's like, okay, Ayuk's, it's over for him. But then we quickly forget because Deebo was so polarizing, Trey Lance is so polarizing. Like Ayuk was really good once he became a full-time player. So that's very encouraging going into his 3rd season. And again, 3rd season receivers tend to break out in year 3 fully. Like sometimes it's 2nd year, but a lot of times you see the 3rd year receiver really break out. It's why I like Chase Claypool this year and Ayuk's going into his 3rd season as well. Is there really any other receiver though? Like Danny Gray they drafted, like it's just tough to make a case for a 3rd receiver on a team that's going to run a lot of 2 wide, a lot of, George Kittle, obviously. So maybe in like the last round, you could take a shot on Danny Gray, but I'm not really into that. So
nope, I don't have any other 49ers receivers ranked.
All right, let's close it out with George Kittle, who it's the same case every year. It's kind of like Nick Chubb of tight ends. You can make the case he's the best all-around tight end in football, but in fantasy, he hasn't even been close to Kelsey or Andrews because of volume and because of route running. Not route running, but routes. He's the best run blocking tight end maybe we've ever seen. Gronk's great too, but he was 2nd among all tight ends in run blocking snaps. And again, the identity of this offense is still to run the football, and George Kittle and Kyle Juszczyk to create running lanes. So Kittle for me is tight end 5 behind Waller, Pitts, and then obviously Andrews and Kelsey. He's still just so good on a per target basis. Like if he told me he would get like 7 targets a game, I think he would smash, but it's tough to put him, like he's obviously in the same tier as Waller, but for me, like I think Pitts is a higher ceiling because he's going to contend for 1,000 yards and over 100 plus targets, then we know what Andrews and Kelsey have done.
Yeah, I have Kittle ranked at the exact same spot, tight end 5. And I think we've talked about this before. He's the teardrop. So after him, there's a teardrop. So if I'm not getting Kelsey or Andrews, I actually usually prefer to wait and then just draft Kittle and let, I like to get Pitts too, but between Kittle and Darren Waller, I actually like Kittle at cost. I have Waller ranked ahead of him. I might change that. But at cost, Kittle is my favorite tight end between those two. But yeah, it's the same story. When he gets targets, he absolutely smashes. He was a tight end 1 in 57% of his games last year. He had back-to-back weeks with over 34 fantasy points. Like, just shows what he can do when he gets the ball. But then he also finished the year with 3 straight games under 7 fantasy points. So a little bit more of a roller coaster than you'll get with Kelsey or Andrews, maybe even Pitts. The talent is obviously there. It's just the usage. You already said it, so I don't want to repeat you too much. But I think people know what they're getting when they get Kittle. I really like him in best ball for those spike weeks. But if I'm drafting Kittle, I am drafting a second tight end. I'm drafting a second tight end in best ball, even if I draft like Travis Kelce. But the second tight end that I'm drafting, if I have Kittle, is somebody that I'm maybe paying a little bit more attention to, finding somebody that will have at least a decent floor, just because Kittle's low weeks have a potential to be really low. Like, there will be some weeks where he only sees 2 or 3 targets.
Which is just insane to even think about, but that's just kind of the way this offense has worked. Kittle last season...
But he finished as the overall tight end 1 in 3 games last year.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't even know if, did Mark Andrews even do that? I'm going to look.
I would guess yes. Like, I know the Colts game, he definitely did.
He did it twice.
Okay.
So Kittle literally has a ceiling as high as any other tight end in the league.
Yeah, he averaged 0.24 fantasy points per snap last season, behind only Gronk, Kelsey, and Andrews. And it wasn't that far behind Kelsey. Andrews was well ahead of the pack at 0.32. The problem is, he was 18th among tight ends in routes run. That shouldn't happen.
That's so low.
He should be top 5. And we talked about this last episode, the tight end preview. Mark Andrews ran 18 more routes per game than George Kittle. That's a massive jump. So if you told me George Kittle would be top 7 in routes, man.
He was 6th in receptions, but 18th in routes.
Yeah, it just shows how good he is on a per target basis and a per play basis when he's involved in the offense. But where he goes in underdog drafts, he's in the 5th round. You could be looking back at it, a year from now and saying, I got George Kittle in the 5th round, because if he gets consistent volume, he can, we talked about this. If you put George Kittle on the Chiefs, he's posting very similar numbers to Travis Kelce.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think anybody, easily.
Yeah.
And the other thing is George Kittle, the only difference too, I don't really care that much, but he has more injury concern than Kelce, than Andrews. We don't really know with Pitts. He's only played 1 year. Waller finally got hurt last season, but he has had some stretches where he missed some games. But yeah, on a per route basis, per target basis, he's still just as good as anybody in football. It's just being 18th in routes run for arguably the best, most talented tight end in football is just odd. And I know he missed a couple games, but still, he per game in terms of routes run, he was 17 or 18 behind Andrews.
Kittle was 3rd in team target market share at 23%. So I guess, one thing that was only behind Andrews and Waller. That was actually ahead of Kelsey in terms of team target market share. So you could make the case that maybe with Trey Lance, the offense totally shifts. It's probably a stretch, because with Lance, they're probably just going to run even more. But if they pass more, Kittle's numbers could really shoot through the roof with that high of a target share. Mm-hmm. But it's unlikely, because Lance probably just means more runs, more read options.
I'll close it out with this. We haven't talked about defense much, but this is a defense that's going to be really good. They have one of the best front sevens in football. And if you're looking for a defense to just draft and then stream and then you can drop or whatever, San Francisco gets the Chicago Bears in week 1, the Seattle Seahawks in week 2. So Then it gets tough with Denver and the Rams.
Pfeiffer's going deep. Look at that. I did not come prepared to talk about defense.
I just pulled it up because I wanted to make sure we don't, I like talking about defense. I like to do IDP leagues. So, then it gets a little tougher with Denver and the Rams, but then they get Carolina, Atlanta. Like, they have some really good matchups. So I tend to just draft the defense with an early schedule that's good and then drop them. But like, this could be a defense that you just go all year and just kind of take your bumps against Denver and the Rams. But like Seattle and Chicago to start the season is pretty much as good as it gets.
I like it. I like that call. It's one of my favorite things to do is draft defenses that have a good early season and then, swap them out. But that way you start off strong. So I like that call right there.
Yeah, man. Always got to show love to defenses. So that'll do it for the San Francisco 49ers team preview. Got two more teams in the NFC West, Seattle Seahawks and the Arizona Cardinals. We'll get to those teams later on this week. Again, keep it locked here at FTN Fantasy. We have a ton of great content on the way. Continuing the breakouts, busts, and bets, I believe it is article where we, break down all the teams. I have my Fantasy Crossroads series. Friday's edition will be David Montgomery and Saquon Barkley, which you would think, okay, Barkley clearly, but it's been a weird couple years for Saquon Barkley. So check that out on Friday. And again, sign up at FTN Fantasy. Season's starting very soon, man. It's going to be exciting. You want to get a part of all the tools, all the great content. And of course, this podcast. Rate, review, subscribe, all that great stuff. We appreciate it. And for Tyler, I'm Adam. Have a great rest of your week. We'll see you guys next time on the FTN Datacast.
Thanks for listening to the FTN Datacast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And follow the hosts on Twitter at Pfeifer24 and at Loechner NFL.